You ever wonder what car brands mechanics absolutely despise? Well, let's break this down. After an interview with many mechanics, I've summarized a great list for you, because if they hate working on these vehicles, you're gonna hate them working on these vehicles. Whether it's access issues, parts that take long to get in, even rust and corrosion can create extra hours of labor. I'm gonna break this down, give you a list of some of the worst vehicles that mechanics absolutely hate, so maybe you can go out there armed with the information to avoid these brutal money pits. Let's get into it now.
Life's too short to drive boring cars.
Many mechanics, when they're asked which vehicles they hate to work on, often BMW is one of those vehicles that enters the chat. Whether it's the 4-cylinder engines, whether it's the straight 6s, or whether it's the V8 engines, like you're looking at vehicles like this that have V8, whether it's naturally aspirated or whether it's the newer and latest and greatest twin turbo V8 engine, they all seem to have some serious issues, and they're not just difficult to work on. The parts are expensive, the labor shop rates are high, and they're just abnormally prone to breakage. And here we have a V8 engine, clearly a big issue with coolant leaks, oil leaks, and just reliability in general makes these very undesirable and difficult access to get into a lot of those critical points for a lot of mechanics. That's why if you can't get at it, they don't like working on it. And a lot of the older 4-cylinder engines had problems with timing chains eating up. Oil pan gasket leaks, valve cover leaks are a big problem, and they're not that easy to fix in a lot of cases. A lot of these 6-cylinder engines are also problematic. Now granted, the latest models in the B48 and B58 are a lot more reliable, but you go back a generation and a lot of the 6-cylinder engines had issues with oil and coolant leaks everywhere. For example, you could get an oil filter housing could have oil and coolant leaks, and that's located up in this area. If that leaks and you've got to reseal it, well, you have to take off the intake manifold because there's a bolt that holds that down. But to get the intake manifold, there's cross braces, you have to take that off. To take that off, there's a base up here you have to remove. You have to remove a whole pile of equipment just to replace that little O-ring that's on the oil filter housing. We also notice that a lot of late model BMWs are using water pumps that are electric. Now, the latest B48 and B58 engines have mechanical water pumps again, but anything that's a few years older and older, if you're looking at 2017 and older, you're going to find typically an electric water pump. And to do an electric water pump, you've got to take that vehicle up off the ground, remove the sheeting off the bottom, and spend the next 8 to 10 hours on the floor actually removing parts. Water pump and thermostat, they're bolted together and very, very difficult to access. And while the parts are often made of tight tolerances and made of high quality, the access to them is absolutely extremely ugly. You want to change out a turbo or a wastegate? You've got to remove half the engine compartment for that as well. Other reasons mechanics absolutely hate working on these, you could go in there to replace a part, like for example a radiator you might have to replace because it sprung a leak, and that's not an abnormal condition. But the problem is all of the cooling lines that go in and out of the radiator or the vent line on top all have these plastic keyed snap together fittings. And they crack and they leak and they break. And the worst part is if you're trying to replace the radiator, those fittings often go with it. You can't break them apart. They're seized because all the heating and cooling cycles. Mechanics absolutely hate them because you end up breaking other parts while you're in there. Or you risk high probability of breaking other parts like other hoses and snapping components, and then it ends up being a much larger job, more difficult, or trying to dance around it, trying to avoid breaking those parts means that you're actually having to take extra precautions. A lot of BMWs, especially as they age, become an absolute thorn in a mechanic's side. Now, another vehicle brand that a lot of mechanics tend to hate, although they're going to stay in the green, they're going to continue making money because these vehicles aren't the most reliable, and the entire brand that we speak of is Jeep. Now here we have a Jeep Grand Cherokee and it's supercharged. Makes it go extremely quickly. It's a lot of fun, a lot of quickness. It looks great. You get Brembo brakes on there. You get the big quad exhaust tips. Absolutely very cool. And a lot of people love driving these vehicles because they go as quick as they do. Yes, you got a lot of great accents, big spoilers, and they look the part. They look very muscular and a lot of people love them. When it comes time to hand the keys to the mechanic to fix that vehicle, they're not loving it. There's a lot of reasons, and every vehicle sort of has its own nuances. Vehicles like this, we know that they have the rotary dial for the automatic transmission in there in a lot of the slightly older generations of some of these Jeeps, and those are known to be a big problem. There's been situations where that dial doesn't work, it won't go to neutral, or it pops out into neutral. And we've even heard a case where somebody lost their life. Well, they got out and actually ended up walking around to the front of the vehicle to open a gate, and the vehicle rolled and crushed them sadly. So it's a problem area, and a lot of mechanics just don't like working on those in that capacity. But there's more Jeeps. The Wrangler is another vehicle that often gets a lot of reputation. While they're fun and interesting to drive, a lot of people love them. They're very popular. They even hold their value. So in some cases that helps you. If you have to spend a lot more money in the service shop, you get some of it back because these tend to hold their value. But these vehicles have a lot of issues, from water leaking into the cabin, shorting out electrics. You can often get a lot of electrical components have crust and corrosion, and mechanics don't like working on fittings that are leaking like that. Obviously, you have other issues with these vehicles because a lot of the quality of the components that go into Jeeps aren't necessarily the best. So whenever you have a vehicle like this, a lot of people tend to drive them hard and put them away wet. So you have other corrosion issues. Like when you look under here, exhaust system and suspension parts take a beating because they end up often corroding, and you get a lot of hard to remove parts, and mechanics don't like to work on that. They often have to cut parts off. I've also heard because the TIPM, the totally integrated power module, is a common failure. Sometimes it throws some mechanics for a ride when you actually have some electrical failures, and it's sometimes related more to the TIPM rather than burnt out lights here, burnt out power windows, or even a no start condition can often lead a mechanic astray, when in fact it's only the TIPM which controls all of the electrical components within the vehicle, and that is not a well-liked part because it's a high probability of failure. Throttle position sensors shouldn't go, but they do. Transmissions shouldn't really fail. In today's technology, they should know by now. And as well, these engines aren't necessarily the most robust. But one of the parts, and we know mechanics don't like working on rusted, corroded parts, we have the suspension components, and you end up with a situation called death wobble, and the suspension parts get loose with age because there's a lot of articulation in that suspension. As they get loose, the vehicle becomes unstable. But to get a lot of suspension and brake parts changed out often means dealing with crusty, rusty parts that are bent and hard to get apart. And that's why mechanics definitely don't like working on rusty, corroded parts. And often these Jeeps, or any other Jeeps, are subject to a lot of those conditions. The next one mechanics absolutely hate and could cost you in the long run for expensive repair prices because they are so problematic is Ford. As we're looking right here, here we have a little Explorer. This is the older generation. They're wonderful vehicles to drive, brand new. Yeah, you get some great rims and new updated tail lights. This is XLT Explorer, but you'll notice the EcoBoost is part of the issue, because they're not all EcoBoost, but what is common are the way that they're a pain for mechanics to work on. Let me give you some examples. Accessing parts, you want to change an alternator or a component, a lot of times there's 2 bolts to remove it, but there's about a 1/4 inch too little space to get a wrench or a ratchet on it, so you end up having to spend 3 or 4 more hours removing 3 or 4 items around just so you can get at that component. That's one big issue. Heater cores, you know the heater core where they circulate coolant so you can blow that through and give a heat into the cabin? That's often buried so deep in the dashboard you have to remove the entire interior just to get access to it. We also can't forget about some of the Super Duty trucks by Ford. You pretty much have to lift the whole cab off to get at the engine, an extreme pain in the butt to work on. And of course, the overall quality and durability of Ford is just not there. And of course, we talked about this one, for example, the EcoBoost, as we see right here, has had its own share of issues. Now, as soon as Ford, you have a brand that is trying to advance all this new technology, but can you imagine putting a bunch of plastic engine parts into a Formula One engine? That's a bit of an analogy, a bit of an exaggeration. But when you're doing all this updated technology, but you're not backing it up with quality, you're gonna have a recipe for disaster. With the EcoBoost engines, they come with turbocharging, variable valve timing, as well as direct injected. A serious combination of efficiency and performance, but durability, out the window, and expensive parts, you betcha. Injectors for direct injected systems are pricey, as are the pumps themselves. And we also know a lot of their trucks have had issues. Well, some of the V8s were more durable than the old 5 liters. Now they go and add the EcoBoost engine turbocharged V6s to some of the late model Ford F-150s. And now they're starting to see issues. 2.7s, dropping valves. They're not the epitome of durability. And of course, because now you're adding extra components like turbocharging, they are adding extra cost to your end bill. But as you look around here, yes, Fords, they are the most popular full-size selling pickup truck in North America. And of course, GM and Chevy are trading punches with that, trying to take that crown. The fact remains, people are still connected and holding on to things of yesteryear. When the older Fords, say for example, older than 2000, were easy to work on. Engine bays were wide open, there was easy space, they had good old-fashioned naturally aspirated V8 engines in some of their bigger vehicles like this, and they were easy to own. But now things have gone turbocharged, direct injected, and now they're getting expensive. But even vehicles, for example, like that new EcoSport, that little SUV that Ford's coming out with, and it has an oil pump that is actually driven by a belt. Whoever thought that was a good idea? Driving your oil pump with a belt and then the belt breaks, and it actually has happened on numerous occasions. And the problem with that is if you're not feeding your engine oil, all of a sudden it starves, you're driving down the road and your engine catastrophically, boom, because that belt is not made for the duty. Most engines conventionally use a set of gears that turn, and they're intermeshed and they're strong and they're durable. Why would they possibly put a belt in there? Because Ford knew that this was a throwaway car, the EcoSport. And a lot of their vehicles are going this way. Chintzier parts for the sake of lower cost manufacturing, and knowing full well most people are done with their vehicles after 3 or 4 years, toss them anyway. They also know that they're going to support the service side of the business, and they're going to do that with more unreliable parts that just make it outside of the warranty period. So Ford in general, many mechanics, almost every mechanic I've spoke to always throws Ford in there of having some biggest duds on the market. And we also know Ford is one of the recall kings. They have new recalls almost every single week in big ones. 2014 F-150s, and of course the rollaway feature, or the sudden downshift with the transmission. The corrosion on the pins to the transmission makes that vehicle act obscurely. We also know that on some of the trucks the rear hub can break, snap, there's a bolt, and then of course it no longer has a park brake and it rolls away. And a whole host of other recalls means that Ford is currently the crown of recalls. Modern day Volkswagens are another one that seems to hit the crap list for a lot of mechanics, because there's a variety of reasons. Obviously, the affiliation between Volkswagen and Audi, a lot of the parts are interchangeable, a lot of the drivetrains are somewhat interchangeable, including the gearboxes. And some of the problem areas that mechanics just can't stand, areas that are way too complex, way too expensive. You gotta wait for parts, for example, like the DCT double clutch gearboxes that you find in a lot of these vehicles are very, very pricey. Now you'll notice a Volkswagen R here, this one will definitely come either with the manual R or the double clutch gearbox, but without the correct amount of maintenance on there. And the worst part is Volkswagen, a lot of mechanics know that people buy the Volkswagen because they didn't have the cash to spring for the Audi, and so a lot of times there's certain aspects of maintenance that get neglected after 3 or 4 years. And looking at a 10-year-old Volkswagen often means you're looking at a lot of neglect, abuse, and that's often usually why they get so hung up on working on these Volkswagens aren't the most loved. On top of it, you have a whole host of issues, not just because you think it's the good old Volkswagen, but because it does share a lot of components with the Audi, including the complexity. So a lot of electrical gremlins, and a lot of times that means hours and hours in the shop for mechanics trying to troubleshoot issues with electrics, windows, Trek engine lights, and a lot of problems like that. And one thing I heard about are, for some strange reason, a lot of the VAG products, the Volkswagen Audi group, specifically Volkswagen, seem to require a specific tool. Every time you get into a new job, whether it's changing a timing belt or you're doing some other upgrade, it often means that you're having to buy a new set of tools. There's new tools, or you need to rush out and buy that new snap-on tool or that scan tool. They don't generally have everything covered in short order. And the worst part is, it just means it stalls out your job. Also, because a lot of the parts are import, it also means sometimes the vehicle sits on the hoist for 2 or 3 days while you have to import another part. These are some common questions and concerns, not to mention oil burning and some of the other issues you find with a lot of the, especially the 2-liter TFSI engines. It's just a whole host of problems built on a platform that's just not built to last the test of time. Another one that I spoke to mechanics about that a lot of them really don't like working on are these vehicles right here, the Range Rovers, Jaguar Land Rover, Range Rover. And while they're not the worst, most unreliable vehicles, they actually don't break much worse than modern day Mercedes-Benz or Audi products. It's more about the packaging and how they're built and put together and engineered that creates all kinds of complex problems for a mechanic to try to solve. I mean, first of all, one thing I've heard are areas that break that shouldn't break. For example, I mean, a lot of these vehicles, these get jammed up in the wintertime. As you see, these handles pop out, and that's a problem. They get iced up, water drips down, seals them up, and then you can't do anything about it. You got to heat it up or mess with that. Of course, down under here, we have the air ride suspension systems with a lot of these. And as you look right there, you can actually see the component right there, which does the self-leveling piece. And the problem is this leveling actuator system, of course, there's all kinds of processes, electronics that drive those different driving modes and features, but it's that area that is known for high probability of failure. Way too many complex issues in a lot of these vehicles that mechanics just get sort of tired of working a lot of those areas. Of course, even going inside these vehicles, they're beautifully wrapped, they're beautifully done, a lot of complex components, but unfortunately what I hear too is when they go in there to fix a lot of parts, other things snap off. You have to access internally, take up panels inside, whether it's door panels, trim panels, and then a lot of times they don't go back on very well, and that becomes very frustrating. Of course, under the hood, on some of the older generation superchargers, the snorkel, and parts that, of course, too much complexity means you have to tear a lot of parts away just to get access to a lot of the mechanical components. It's just a very complex vehicle all the way around. A lot of mechanics just don't like that level of complexity. The other part is, just like some of the other brands, the vehicle often sits on the hoist where you have to wait a week or two. I had to do the same. I have a Jaguar F-Type and I had to wait about a week for them to get a new SIM card because the infotainment system or the navigation stopped working and they believed it was a SIM card issue. I had to wait for a week. So a lot of these vehicles sit, and the mechanics don't like a vehicle that they can't finish. They have to put it to the side, put it back out to the yard, and it's just frustrating vehicles to work on. Are they the most unreliable vehicles on the planet? Well, they're certainly up there, but I wouldn't say they're the worst, but it's really more about working on them. They're complex, overly complex, and that's a big reason why mechanics don't love them. Another brand, well, I'll just say it's a sister brands. We have a Hyundai here and a Kia are the brother and sister brands of manufacturers that are most hated by a lot of modern day mechanics. But vehicles like this look great and they provide all the technology, and that's why people were buying these. But there's so many on the road now that unfortunately have been the result of a bad engine failures, and that's the problem. Whether it is the ABS brake controller system, which leaks inside and then you wind up with brake fluid in the electrics and then it burns the car, or whether you actually have that catastrophic bottom end rod bearing issue because of metallics in the oil, or any number of other electric gremlins or problems that lead to a fire on these vehicles, a lot of people are happy with them. And I'm glad you are. But a lot of mechanics I spoke to, specifically this local one here, other than the fact that they're becoming a very, very well practiced engine replacer. Essentially, they're replacing engines, dropping new engines in every single week. There's so many of these vehicles that are going up and the engines need replacing. Obviously, with a lot of these engine challenges, Kia and Hyundai are some of the biggest and worst culprits for bad engine designs right out of the box. He also comments that a lot of parts are poorly made, snapped together. Some of the plastics on the connectors are commonly break, and then you have to find workarounds. A lot of parts are substandard. They feel that way and they don't last very long. Once they replace parts, they find it going back in there a year later, replacing another OEM part. So overall, what I've heard from mechanics, the parts are lower quality, and with all of the engine fires, you're becoming nothing but a glorified engine replacer. So this is a sad state of affairs, and one of the vehicles, Hyundai Kia, that I definitely know mechanics absolutely hate. And with all of that said, if you're buying a used vehicle, you're going to want to check out my hot to trot inspection checklist. It's going to help you search and find your next vehicle and not make a mistake by buying a dud. Hope to see each and every one of you in the next one. We'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.